Thank you, Dana, and thank all of you for coming. As Dana mentioned, I'm Carrie Folan. I'm the founder of Shore Lit. And this is really the library's event, but they invited me to moderate, and I was thrilled because I think I almost literally have Chris Tilghman to thank for moving here from Brooklyn. I took this exact copy of The Right-Hand Shore with me on a bike trip from Lewis, Delaware to Ocracoke, North Carolina, and read it the whole way. So I'm kind of biking and camping in this landscape as I'm reading Chris's descriptions of the landscape and the history, and I fell in love with the Eastern Shore and ultimately moved here. So I am especially thrilled to have the opportunity to meet him and have this conversation. So thanks all of you for being here. And Chris, we had talked a little bit about maybe starting at the beginning, where you enter the house from Mason's Retreat.
Yeah, well, I mean, thank you all for coming. Yes? No? Can you hear me? Closer? Okay. Thank you all for coming, and I'm delighted to be here. Thanks to Scotty for putting this together. Great thanks to Carrie for sitting up here with me, taking some of the heat. And I'm delighted to say some family and friends from Queen Anne's County have come down, have chance to come down here. So I'm grateful to them and grateful to all of you. Yes, we as Carrie and I talked, we thought we would sprinkle a few little passages in, and I'll start with this one and then maybe explain why I start with it. But this is from Mason's Retreat, the first novel in the what has become a series, but was never imagined to be that originally, that I published in 1996. This passage describes a family. This is in 1935. Edward Mason has inherited this place he knows very little about. He's been living in England with his wife and two sons, and they're broke. It's the heat of the Depression, and he has to come back and take up residence in this house. And so this is what greets them as they arrive. At night, of course. Okay. It starts with, Sebastian is one of the sons. We heard you, said Sebastian, but not with much sarcasm, because he, like his father and mother, was nearly stunned at what the slow gathering of illumination revealed. The place was huge, the rooms vast and square. It was Victorian, not Georgian. It seemed more than anything to have been inspired by the overgrown villas of the French Riviera, with a central hall providing a conduit for the breezes between the land and water sides, and French doors opening every room on two sides onto a broad, tile-floored porch. It was a house designed to catch the perfumes of the Mediterranean or even of the Chesapeake, but a window had not been opened in years, and the air that night was the worst of it, thick with the odors of neglect, mold and moth, rot and rust. Long strips of Chinese wallpaper hung off the walls in spirals as if left over from a gay party. An animal, not a mouse or a rat, but something large like a fox or a dog, had died long ago in the center of the hall, leaving only the black stain of its dried juices and a moldy skeleton. In the dining room, there was a table for 24 that was covered by a confused jumble of plaster and lath, rodent nests and locust cocoons, all of it given forth from a rotten, water-damaged ceiling. Edith wondered what kind of sound it had made, this crash, deep in some abandoned winter. Look at this, Simon, the other boy hooted. He was holding up an Indian hatchet. He'd walked back to the center of the hallway and was peering over a vast table candlestick in one hand. Aborigines, Indians, corrected Sebastian. But he came over with his lantern to see what else was in this grand stew, this sea of objects. An oval miniature portrait of a young man, a few Indian arrowheads, a brass model of a tractor, a lady's ivory and silk fan, a set of lacquered Chinese boxes, a book. Simon picked it up. "Wild animals I have known," he announced. He dropped it as they both moved on, entering what must have been a library where they were confronted by the broad face and shiny black nose of a Jersey calf. "Bloody hell," yelled Sebastian, "it's stuffed." Edward walked from room to room with a large green-shaded student lamp in his hand. He held it up to the portraits, all these masons peering arrogantly through the dull whitened sheen of their own private mildew. They didn't seem to mind their fate, but it was unimaginable to Edward that this place had been waiting for him all these years in such a state of suspended breath. Clearly, when Miss Mary died, no one had a clue what to do with the place. In England, it would have been maintained as before, with little notice taken that one member of the household, the owner, was no longer there. In other less civilized lands, the house would have been picked clean by distant relatives and villagers. In fact, his quick survey had revealed an array of objects that appeared quite saleable. His English friends had been marketing such family heirlooms for years. But here they just closed the door and would have kept it closed as the house settled slowly into its foundation, back to the earth. Edward supposed that what in the end surprised him was not the neglect of the house, but its lack of meaning, its absence of value for anyone but him, and at that, it had taken over a decade of ownership before he set foot in the place.
Was it really that bad?
Yeah. The reason I start there is really everything I've done in these books, these four, begins at that point. And it begins, as my brothers here know well, of my family growing up in outside Boston, but coming down here starting very early in the 50s, as my parents tried to decide what to do with this house and farm. This description was what it was like every year. There was another animal had died. There was one year a turkey buzzard had just flown all over the place. There are other places where I described it, go in the pantry with all of this stemware and black, snake skins weaving in and out. And it was really this lens that colors my entire sense of that. I say distancing myself a little, because in my fiction I distance myself a lot, but of that family and of that house, I take in some ways a sort of a darker view than I think some of my brothers do. But basically, we all knew that was how we entered this world. So there it is. That's the start.
So as Dana mentioned, there are 3 published books in the series and one that is coming out, either 23, 24 eventually.
Yeah.
But they don't necessarily go in chronological order. So for anyone who has not read the books in the series, could we do just a brief summary of the story of the Masons?
Yeah. Well, I don't know how to tell it except backwards. But anyway, geez, now you're asking me to be chronological, Carrie. How am I going to do this? It really...
You can go in any direction you want.
This whole thing is based on the Tilghman family. They were all over the damn place, as all of you know, I guess, at islands and towns and this and that. Really all started in the farm now that we are privileged to own and to live in to a greater or lesser degree in Centerville, on the Chester River. And I picked up with that story of Edward Mason coming over in the 30s with some little shard of a story that my grandparents had done that. They lived in England. This was their life. And so I published that in, as I said, 1996. And I had quite a lot of material of what led up to this point that I'd cut away, and I'd done a certain amount of research, not so much family history research, but local history research. And so nonetheless, I published this in 1996, and I felt great. I've done it. I had sort of taken up the challenge of that arrival at that house late at night and was very satisfied with what I'd done. So then I went on. I published another book of short stories and another novel. At this point, I'd moved to Virginia with my family. And along about 2007, 2008, I began to think I wanted to go back and pick up the story earlier. So the second book, published in 2012, is The Right-Hand Shore. And it is likewise, its chronology is rather complex, and there's stories within stories of it. It's easy reading, don't get me wrong. It's just hard for me to figure out. But in any event, it picks up the story of just before the Civil War, and follows the farm going into peaches. There was this peach boom, which the more I read about it and the more I researched about it, the more it surprised me that I'd never heard of it. Mm-hmm. And I don't think people know very much about this spectacular rise of peach orchards. At one point, Delaware, the three counties of Delaware and Caroline County and Queen Anne's County and Kent County, were the biggest peach producers in the world by a huge margin. And it all rose spectacularly fast and crashed with a blight that they knew was happening. They only figured out years later that it was a virus, because viruses weren't figured out until years later. But in any event, so that's the story of the rise and fall of this effort to find a use for this farm. And it involves, all of these are stories in black and white, because these are black lives and white lives that made this all happen. And there is at the heart of this book a child, two children, the son of the owner and the daughter of the black orchardman, a sort of accomplished family, old free black family that live down the road. And so this long friendship turns into a love affair. And by the end of it, there's plot spoilers to be done, but still, they finally are marry and escape to France, which was the only thing they could do. And again, this is I'm talking some family stories here, but not so much the escape to France. It was more tragic end in our family, this love affair, but in any event. And so then the third book, Thomas and Beale and the Midi, is entirely in France. And it's that young couple having a very difficult time sort of finding their way, and they end up in the south of France with a vineyard, going to sort of wineries. This idea of sort of agriculture and what people do with the land is really what I'm interested in. So, and besides, what were they to do? So that gets us to there, and then the new one, which publishing, like everything else now, I don't know what COVID has to do with printing, but it seems to be slowing things down. Anyway, so I don't know. I still haven't a firm date. It's done, but a year from now or maybe into 24. Don't know. But in any event, that book on the Tobacco Coast brings it together to the present day. But it also contains a novel within a novel about the first Masons, i.e. Tilghman's, landing in the 1650s. So that's it. I never had a plan. I never have thought of it as any kind of a series. It's just, I just wrote the next one, and then I got going on it. And so now I think, I know this is the last one, the one coming out, and I'm ready to number them, and I think my publisher is ready to do something like that.
Very good job putting everything in order.
Yeah, right.
So what is that, about 150 years that So the Crossroads series that Dana mentioned, that of which this event is a part, is interrogating the way that rural life has changed in America. There are few writers who have thought as deeply about this in relation to the Eastern Shore as you have. What have you seen change in the 150 years that the Mason family has been living on the Eastern Shore?
Well, it's a story. It's such an interesting story, agriculture on the Eastern Shore, because it goes in these sort of waves. That, you know, first it was going to be this, and then it was going to be this, but then a blight killed it all. Then it was going to be this, and so it's really there's this sequence of agricultural industries. And there's also this marked change in the soil types from the north to the south. So the whole thing is revolving around, this is a theme, I'll read a piece related to this in a second. Mm-hmm. But it sort of revolves around finding what this peculiar spit of sand and clay is really useful for, what it does, what it's good for. And clearly, the first crop here was beaver pelts, if you can call that a crop. But after that, as you all know, it was tobacco, hence the Tobacco Coast. A historian called it that, and I've picked it up. But it was tobacco from the 1660s on, with tremendous booms and busts, and every time France and England went to war, the tobacco market fell apart. And that really continued till about, on our farm, I was surprised actually to see some farm records from the mid-1780s where tobacco was still the major and maybe the only cash crop. So tobacco continued here really maybe through the Revolution. Then it goes through this sort of sequence of small grains, and suddenly it's to be the breadbasket. But then the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad comes along and brings in vastly greater quantities of wheat from Ohio, and once again the idea of the cash crop on the Eastern Shore is, well, it's not going to work out quite that way. And then there is the peaches that I've described, and then there's down south. There's more berries and truck gardens but that begins to fall apart. And then there's dairies in the north, and dairies was it was a dairy. Our family farm was a dairy until 1990, and there's almost no dairies. I don't know if there's a commercial dairy in the Eastern Shore.
Lewis, maybe? Is there
Lewis,
still?
I suppose. Mm-hmm. There's still a... Yeah, but not much.
Right.
And it was kind of the right thing to do. The soils up here, more farther in the north, were good for hay and for pasturage and fodder, and it kind of worked. But it was too far from Baltimore and Philadelphia and et cetera, et cetera. Milk is hard to deal with.
So the history of agriculture on the Eastern Shore is essentially a series of failures. Yeah,
it kind of is. And just to finish the story, where we are now is in 1923, a woman named Cecile Steele. Does anyone know who Cecile Steele was? She was a nice, enterprising farm lady in Ocean View, Delaware, who put in her annual order for 50 chickens. Layers. That was it. There was no market for chicken meat. No one ate chicken meat in the 19th century. There was, if there was any agriculture with chickens, it was in eggs. Cecile ordered 50 chickens and got 500. and she figured, well, what am I going to do with this? And so she raised them and sold them, in October. For 62 cents a pound. So the following year, she ordered 5,000. And within about 5 years, there were millions of broilers. The whole broiler industry started there, and now here we are. So Should I?
Yes, what does Mr. French have to say about this?
Yeah, right. So this is the context for this next quick reading here. In The Right-Hand Shore, the man that you've heard walking around through the house with his student lamp, Edward Mason, has come to the retreat, as I call the farm, in order to meet the woman, the unmarried, dying heiress, the owner of it, in order to determine whether he is fit to. She wants to give it to him because he's the only sort of Mason in the direct line that she could find. Now, this is absolutely the story of the Tilghmans. This is how my grandfather came to be given the house in 1918 through the same deal, because the family was daughtering out, and something had to be done. So Edward has come to visit and to sort of pay a call. And he ends up spending the day with Mr. French, who is the farm manager. And they give him the story, and that's how it gets back to 1857 when it starts. That's why I say there are stories within stories. But here is Mr. French and Mason. He's shown him around. The tour is over, and French, out of gratitude for this last remark, doesn't matter, out of a sudden avuncular fondness that surprises him, asks Mason if he would like to come down to his house for some lemonade. Mason accepts. They discuss the current crew of workers as they pass by their modest homes, and French corrects Mason's suggestion that good labor is hard to find. No, he says, there's always been too much labor, too many good men and women on the Eastern Shore for the last 100 years, white and black, eager to work, eager to join a going concern. Too much labor, a condition against all logic and the laws of economics. And there's too much land, says French. There's too much of everything on the Eastern Shore. Mr. French was raised in Pennsylvania, where there was just a tiny bit less of everything that everyone wanted and needed, which yielded a fine, equitable society. French takes Mason to the back door of his 4-square home, one of the few structures on the place not built by Miss Mary, the person he's getting the farm from, called the French House in his honor. He introduces him to Alice, a solid, broad-shouldered woman with a round face and chipmunk cheeks that bespeak warmth and equanimity. She's quite tall, like Mary, a race of Amazons, Edward thinks, and for a moment tries to formulate a joke along these lines that he will share at the club when he gets back to Boston, as if he had spent weeks lost in the jungle. The three of them settle under the porch awnings to enjoy the water view, and Mr. French, buttressed by his wife's presence, the comfort of the porch, and the throat-loosening tang of lemonade, is happy to take a few minutes to tell stories of Mason's retreat. The retreat has been their home, a place for daughters to be born and grow, their life's work. First the peaches, then the cows. Neither orchardist nor animal husband. French is a manager, a leader of enterprises, a good judge of men. In years to come, French will regret that he never sees Mason again, not after Miss Mary's death, when Mason became owner of the retreat, but in no way its master. In time, Mr. French will forget entirely about Edward Mason as the retreat enters what he knows is going to be its decline, because in this century, with its already established alternating pattern of orgies of destruction and binges of consumption, there is really no obvious role for the retreat to play. It has been remade twice in French's lifetime and denied both times, denied a third time, denied thrice, when the Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus refused it as a retreat for prayer and contemplation. Besides those fewer and fewer works who make their livelihood on the place, no one needs the retreat. Mr. French will regret that he never sees Mason again, because he thinks that the man has been raised to accomplish very little in his life. But if he came to the retreat, picked it up as it fell from Miss Mary's ravaged palm, if Mason had done that, it would have been good for him and good for the retreat. But it didn't happen. When Mr. French died in 1928, Mason was in England and now quite definitively a fool. The retreat was in decline, and no one had the slightest interest in saving it. You see why I say this I have sort of a dark view.
I should say there's a lot of joy and happiness in this book as well. We're just not reading those parts. So, Chris, you said that there are kind of two-pronged themes in this book. The idea of the Eastern Shore is about land, agriculture, and it's about race.
Yes. Yeah, well, it is indeed a story in black and white. This is a sort of a subtitle that I've stolen from a very good friend of my wife's and mine, named Henry Winsick, one of the great historians of slavery in the U.S., and his remarkable prize-winning book, The Hairstons, A Story of a Family in Black and White, was so good that I've sort of stolen it for times like this. But this is a story of white characters and black characters existing in some cases in the sort of the equal labor of the fields, and that's what happens in the right-hand shore. As I said, the black orchardist is an extremely accomplished person, and they work side by side, but it's also a story of privilege against those trying to get by. It's a story clearly of the Reconstruction, which in some ways is sort of the worst chapter of American history as far as I'm concerned. Clearly, slavery was the darkest moment, but there's something about Reconstruction that is so malevolent that every time I read about it, and I certainly could recommend some cheerful reading to be done about it, but still. So it has been very much a story of black and white.
Did you want to read a section from Thomas and Beale? So Thomas and Beale, as we said, is the third book in the series, the most recent one that's been published. It's when Thomas and his wife Beale escape to France, essentially, so that they can live as a married couple. She's black, he's white. Do you want to read that quick section?
Sure. It's sort of a nice little section that just in order to give the book its due, read one. But they do end up landing in Paris. It was, if the countryside of France was not necessarily less aware of race, certainly Paris in that time was a place where white and black could be together, and indeed could be married, although as extremely rare as that was. There's a wonderful letter home by Frederick Douglass. After all, we're going to be in his room drinking wine. But he writes about going into a hotel in Paris, I think just about the time Thomas and Beale arrived, 1892, 1893. And he's walking into a hotel, and a liveried person is coming up, Monsieur, and doing this, and Douglass turns around to see who he's talking to. And of course he's talking to Frederick Douglass. It's just, the next person coming in. And so there's wonderful, sort of a wonderful story, but still a difficult story. Well, anyway, so they arrive in Paris under the wing of the Catholic order. There's a sort of a theme of Catholicism that I sort of enjoy that runs through these books. I wasn't raised Catholic, and I don't know how many of the Tilghmans were, but it's of course part of the Maryland history, so I adopted it early. But they end up in Paris, and Thomas is trying to figure out what to do. He doesn't have enormous wealth. I've always wanted these books to, the wealth was kind of in the past. That's what all the decay is about. And there's this requirement, this need to make some money. I mean, to make the land provide a living. And so Thomas has this sort of winter to try and figure out what to do. And he comes upon this idea of grapes. And he comes upon this section of France that is neither Burgundy or neither Burgundy or Bordeaux. It's Languedoc, which is very much of a local vin d'étable at best. Huge wine growing, grape growing region, but only until quite recently was ever Pays d'Oc or its various appellations, whatever. Anyway, so he goes there. But so here is him. He's just been given a very rough time by a nun, by the Mother Superior, who clearly thinks he's a fool and sort of a rich American, and she says, she says something like, she said, yes, okay, anyway. Now on the way out, as a sort of parting shot, Mother Digby said, I think you will find that a number of young Americans are taking up residence here. Artists, she said, once again curling her lip, in many cases. I do not expect to be seeking out either Americans or artists, he answered. I am here because I'm trying to get away from Americans, and I don't think any artist would have much interest in me. Quite, she had answered. But after lunch, Thomas was indeed heading off in the company of an American. They've met a young, sort of a hapless young American artist, student, at their little hotel. In the company of an American who called himself an artist. The sun was already low, and they wound through the twists and turns of these ancient streets as they wound. Thomas was intermittently bathed in light from the sun behind him and groping in the darkness of shadow. Some of the buildings, 5-story apartments, seemed modern. Some of them seemed nothing more than peasant cottages sandwiched in between. Every few blocks there was a whole new line of shops, their fronts plastered with signboards advertising wonders that seemed unlikely in these dreary little hovels. Stanley, that's the artist, and Thomas had to keep stepping up onto the stoops and sidewalks to avoid the drays and wagonettes hurtling down the middle of the street. The whole purpose of all this vastness, it seemed, was to cram more than 2 million souls into the tightest, dingiest spaces imaginable. It seemed like the life of moles. Any people Thomas could glimpse in these gloomy caves stood as black silhouettes. Thomas could glimpse in the midst of all this, Stanley Dean kept up a continuous stream of facts and details. Here's where the cafe where all the medical students go after class. Here's where we buy paint and canvas. There you can see the towers of Saint-Sulpice. Here's where my friend has a room. The closer they got to what appeared to be Dean's destination at the center of the quarter, the dingier it all looked, and the more Thomas felt out of place. As a child of the flatlands along the Chesapeake Bay, the two elements that were irreplaceable for him were light and wind. Beale felt the same way, light and wind. When you've been raised in both, you cannot live without either. That's what Thomas believed. Struggling down these cramped, airless streets reminded him of being all but lost in the miles of his father's peach trees, where you could be overcome by the oily fragrance of the blossoms or the buzzing of bees and wasps. But just as it used to occur when Thomas finally reached the edge of the orchards, Thomas and Stanley Dean rounded the last corner and burst into the light of a broad intersection of boulevards and a large open plaza in front of a largish church. Thomas exhaled with relief. There were cafes on 2 of the corners, and they seemed to be filling up. Dean suggested they might sit for a lemonade or a beer. Sounds as if all my characters, all they do is drink lemonade. Happens to be. Anyway, so yes, so that's fun to read. Carrie, I think, just likes the line about light and wind, and I think we all do.
Well, and one thing I love about that book is, although it is set in France, in the Languedoc, in the Midi, you do get these echoes of the Eastern Shore, these images of the Eastern Shore every so often. And of course, Thomas and Beale have a certain homesickness. They have memories, reminiscences. And so these landscapes are almost layered throughout these books. What about the 4th book, right? The 4th book, which is coming up, is going to take place in the context, our current context of climate change.
Well, it was, yeah. It's as I think, I don't know if I said or not, a single day in July 4th, 2019. I chose that date for several reasons. first of all, because I didn't want to deal with COVID. Secondly, I didn't want to deal with the election and Trump. And third, because this is a return, and there are two characters from Mason's Retreat who are still alive for On the Tobacco Coast, and they couldn't be 100. If they were 96, okay, but no. So I moved it back. But yes, and it involves the return of Thomas and Beale's great-grandson, and it's really an attempt, my attempt to at least have a conversation. I have no answers, but a conversation about sort of the uses and abuses of history. And it's really about the effort to come to terms with our slaveholding past, and why stop there, to come to terms with the eradication of the Indians. And so here's this family, lives on the spot, and that one has to sort of understand what any redress is possible. Should it be? So anyway, that's the sort of the conversation that over a long dinner party in this. But it's really a family book, and it's supposed to be funny. Just saying. Should we do the black characters thing?
I think for time,
Okay.
let's see what kind of questions we have
Okay.
from the audience. But I would
Okay.
love to hear that paragraph, that excerpt
yes.
from the fourth section.
Oh yes. So the. Oh yes, I do have it. Oh yes. So this book, as I say, is all one day, but there's a section that goes forward 50 years. It sort of screams forward. It's about 8 pages, and it's kind of what happens to everyone. And there was a theme. I had sort of thought of it as being a climate change. In somewhat, there's kind of a genre of climate change. And in fact, in this very room, we heard Earl Swift, who is a friend of ours from Charlottesville, in fact, read from his wonderful book, Chesapeake Requiem, which I cannot recommend too highly, about climate change, a loss of culture, loss of land. So in the end, I look 50 years, and I sort of have to face this as a tale that I only can hope doesn't happen, and it's possible still. But anyway, so here's how the whole thing ends. There's a tiny coda after this, but that doesn't matter. This is how all this stuff I've been talking about ends for me. There have been hurricanes on the Chesapeake recorded by English settlers since the Great Hurricane of 1667. That's spelled Hurry, new word Cane. Eleanor, this is I said there's a novel within a novel. Eleanor is the daughter of the family who's writing this novel. Eleanor had always intended a gripping account of surviving that event as the transition into the second third of her novel. And watermen and coastal landowners of more recent times remembered Hazel and Agnes and Isabel as great moments of change. But now the storms began to hit routinely, began to make it clear that Mother Nature, who created this estuary when the glaciers receded 10,000 years ago, was reconsidering the whole thing. On the river shore of the retreat, the surges crested now and again the low banks behind where the family had gathered on that last July 4th, and drove unchecked once in a while across the fields of corn and soybean and wheat. The organic grain farmer that leased the land from Harry was getting ready to take the operation inland. "She's as poor as Caroline," was the old saying on the eastern shore, but sandy, well-drained, landlocked Caroline County now had the last laugh. Have you tried any of their wines, the Chambourcin, the Tannat blends? Ethan, the son who now lives in the house, had long recognized that there was a natural feature in the retreat's holdings, a depression that began as a small inlet off the end of Mason's Creek, ran across the field and caused a dip in the state road. At one time, teenagers from town called this dip the launching pad, because if they hit it at about 70, all 4 wheels would leave the road. This was the exact spot on that July 4th decades ago that he and Heidi, a girlfriend, Coming home after the fireworks passed me Lou and Alice Howe on the way to Weatherly, blinding both drivers for a second. The dip continues a slight fold into the woods where even on the driest summers the lady ferns thrived and the footing on the moss was spongy, and then the land dropped ever so slightly to join a similar lick off the next creek upriver where the Spartina and Phragmites were waiting. The day finally came. It seemed like a single day to Ethan, as if the weirs and bulkheads of either end of a freshly dug canal were pulled down to allow the water to flow into it, that the two creeks joined. It was not that sudden, of course. First, the licks of Spartina and bulrush and Phragmites began to cut deeper and deeper. Then a nameless storm surge drove the waters of both creeks inland, and they made their first contact. Then for a number of years, while motorists complained bitterly, one's drive down the neck went into about 100 feet of broken pavement, often with standing salt water. And finally, the county built a sort of causeway over this section. There was a custom in Maryland to give the names of even quite trivial bodies of water under a bridge or overpass, even a sluiceway that went through a large culvert, but no one knew exactly what to call this new feature. In truth, this was hardly the only place where this problem existed. So the road crew erected a generic sign saying simply, water. Water and more water. When all this was done, what had finally happened was that the retreat, a haven, a hermitage, call it what you will, became an island. Maybe that's what it had always been, a place to hide a world apart. So.
I love that, especially, yeah, we should clap for that for sure.